The phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and stepped outside the makeshift clinic, where the midday sun cast long shadows across the quiet village. Seeing the name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Richard. I almost didn't pick up. After years of dealing with my stepfather's antics, I knew his calls rarely brought good news. But something, maybe a glimmer of hope or curiosity, made me answer. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice even. "Catherine," he said, his tone too bright, too upbeat. "Just wanted you to know I sold the mountain cabin." I froze, tightening my grip on the phone. "You did what?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I sold it," he repeated, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. "Don't look so surprised. It's for the greater good." "Mine, obviously." He let out a smug laugh that made my blood run cold. "My name is Catherine, and for as long as I can remember, Richard has been a constant thorn in my side. My mom married him when I was 15, and he quickly wormed his way into the family with charm and humour. But beneath that facade, he was always a man who prioritized his own needs above anyone else's. The cabin wasn't just a vacation home, it was my refuge, a place I'd lovingly nurtured over the years. Nestled in the mountains, it was where I found peace after stressful work trips, hosted friends for weekend getaways, and recharged. Hearing Richard talk about it like it was just another asset to manipulate was infuriating. "You had no right," I said, my voice trembling. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Relax," he responded lazily. "I've been managing things here while you're off playing hero. And besides, what's the point of holding on to something you're never around to enjoy? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later." "I'll thank you when hell freezes over," I snapped, hanging up before he could reply. I paced, trying to steady myself as a storm of emotions raged inside. Richard's arrogance had crossed a line, but what he didn't know, and what I would keep to myself for now, was that the cabin wasn't entirely mine to sell. My best friend Laura was a co-owner, and we had set up a legal agreement years ago that required both of our signatures for any sale to go through. This wasn't over. I sank onto the edge of my cot, staring at my phone as though it might combust. Richard's smug tone echoed in my mind. How could he think it was okay to sell something so personal to me as if it were just a commodity for his own benefit? The cabin wasn't just a building, it was my lifeline. It held memories of summer nights chasing fireflies and hiking with my mom before she remarried. After she passed, it was the one constant, the one place that remained steady when everything else seemed to fall apart. Richard, of course, had no such connection to it. To him, it was just another resource to exploit. But this time, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I tapped Laura's name in my contacts and waited for her to answer. "Hey, Kathy, what's up?" she said, sounding cheerful. "Richard sold the cabin," I blurted out, unable to hide the anger in my voice. There was a long pause on her end. "He what?" Laura asked, stunned. "Apparently he needed the money to pay off some gambling debts," I said, my voice dripping with bitterness. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants, but I know our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the right to sell it without your consent." Laura let out a low whistle. "He really thought he could get away with this. That man has no shame. None." "I agree," I replied. "I'm going to need your help to sort this out. I'll finish my volunteer work and head back home as soon as I can. In the meantime, can you pull up the legal documents? I want to be ready to counter this when I get back." "You got it," Laura said, her voice firm. "We'll handle this together." As I hung up, an unexpected calm washed over me. Richard thought he could outsmart me, that I was too far away to do anything about his betrayal. But he had no idea who he was messing with. I wasn't the scared teenager anymore, the one who let him walk all over me. Now I was an adult, with resources, allies, and a solid understanding of the law. If he thought this was over, he was about to get a rude awakening. The following days blurred together as I completed my volunteer assignment, trying to keep my emotions in check. But no matter how busy I kept myself, Richard's betrayal lingered like an unwelcome shadow. I couldn't shake the image of him gloating over settling his debts at my expense. Late one evening, I sat down with my journal, something I always brought with me on trips. Writing helped me process my feelings, and I needed clarity now more than ever. As I scribbled furiously, the memories came rushing back. The first time I visited the cabin with my mom, the countless hours spent restoring it with Laura, the quiet nights by the fireplace when the world seemed to pause. This wasn't just a building. It was a part of me. And Richard thought he could just sell it off like a poker chip. Number not this time. The next day, Laura called again, her tone all business. "I went through the co-ownership agreement," she said. "You were right. He didn't have the authority to sell without my consent. The sale is invalid." Relief washed over me, but it quickly turned to anger. "Do we know who he sold it to?" "Not yet," Laura replied. "But I pulled the county records and there's no official transfer of ownership. It looks like he might have tried to do this under the table." That sounded exactly like Richard, always looking for shortcuts, always trying to game the system. "What's our next step?" I asked. "Well," Laura said, "we can either confront him directly, or we can let the legal process handle it. Either way, we're in the clear. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." I exhaled, relieved. "Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said warmly. "But I'll always have your back." As I hung up, a plan began to form in my mind. I would finish my work here, return home, and face Richard head-on. I wasn't going to scream or shout. That's what he expected. No, I'd take a different approach. I'd use the one thing Richard always underestimated, my ability to think ahead. He thought he'd won, but by the time I was done, he'd realize he'd underestimated me for the last time. When I finally got home, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The cabin had always been a place of peace for me, but now the silence felt different, heavy, almost threatening. My houseplants were wilting slightly, the mail had stacked up by the door and the fridge was nearly empty. I set my bags down and took a deep breath, the weight of everything I needed to do settling on my shoulders. Before I could even unpack, my phone buzzed. It was Richard. I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but then I decided against it. Time to face him. "Well, well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter," he said, his voice oozing with fake cheer. "Finally back to reality, huh?" "What do you want, Richard?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. "I just wanted to check in," he replied, his tone dripping with smugness. "Make sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, so there's no use crying over spilled milk." My jaw tightened. "Funny you should say that," I said, keeping my tone steady, "because as far as I can tell, it's not gone. Laura and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't go through. You can't sell something that doesn't belong to you." There was a long pause, just enough to let me know I'd hit a nerve. "That's ridiculous," Richard said, his voice now strained. "The buyer paid in cash, and the paperwork's all done. It's a done deal." "No, it's not," I replied. "Laura and I co-own the cabin, remember? Without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it's still ours." His laugh was sharp and brittle. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. You don't know how hard I've had it, Catherine. I did what I had to do." "You stole from me," I shot back, unable to hold it in. "And you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? You've made your choices, Richard, and now you'll have to live with them." With that, the conversation ended. Him hanging up on me. I stood there, phone in hand, my hands shaking from a mix of anger and triumph. For years I had let Richard manipulate me, guilt-trip me, and take advantage of my patience. But not anymore. This time I wasn't just defending the cabin. I was reclaiming my boundaries, my voice, and my peace of mind. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open as I reviewed the documents Laura had sent me. The co-ownership agreement was clear. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's written consent. Richard's actions weren't just unethical, they were downright illegal. I was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. When I opened it, there he was, Richard wearing his usual smug expression. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, though he didn't wait for my answer before stepping inside. I crossed my arms, watching as he casually made himself comfortable in one of my chairs. "What do you want, Richard?" "Catherine," he started, his tone dripping with condescension. "I know you're upset, but you have to understand my position. I was desperate. The people I owed money to weren't exactly patient." I raised an eyebrow. "And you thought stealing my property was the solution?" "Borrowing," he corrected, as though that made it better. "I was going to make it back once my luck turned around. I would have paid you back every penny." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter edge to my voice. "Your luck? That's what you're betting on, Richard? You've been gambling away money for as long as I've known you, and it's never worked out." "Why would this time be any different?" he asked, shifting uncomfortably, though his bravado quickly returned. "You're overreacting. It's just a cabin. You're not even here most of the time. Why not let someone else make use of it?" "Because it's mine," I snapped, my voice firm. "Because it's my home. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my property. And for the record, Laura values it just as much as I do. Your little sale is invalid. And you know it." His face darkened, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of fear. "You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you? You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Try me." For the first time, Richard had no snappy response. He stood up, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I slumped back into my chair, heart pounding. The confrontation had shaken me, but there was also a sense of satisfaction. Richard was starting to realize that his usual tactics wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about standing up to someone who had taken advantage of me for far too long. After Richard's dramatic exit, I called Laura to update her. "He showed up at my house," I said, pacing the living room. "Tried to spin some sob story about borrowing the cabin to settle his debts." Laura snorted. "Borrowing? Does he even hear himself? What did you say?" "I told him the sale was invalid, and if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities." That seemed to shake him a little, I continued. "But knowing Richard, he's probably already planning his next move." "Let him scheme," Laura replied firmly. "We've got the law on our side. I've contacted a lawyer to help us draft a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to shut it down." Her words grounded me. "Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said warmly. "But we're in this together." Over the next few days, I focused on gathering all the evidence I could. I documented the co-ownership agreement, collected screenshots of text messages Richard had sent about the sale, and even tracked down the real estate agent involved. When I reached out to the agent, her voice was tense. "Look, I didn't know the full situation," she said quickly. "Richard told me he had permission to sell. If I'd known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have touched the deal." "Well, now you do," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm not trying to drag you into this, but I need your cooperation. Can you confirm that Richard signed the paperwork alone?" "Yes," she admitted. "The buyer hasn't paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can provide you with the documents if you need them." "That would be helpful," I said, jotting down her information. As I hung up, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Richard had banked on me being too passive or too distant to fight back, but he was about to learn how wrong he'd been. That evening, Laura called with more good news. "The letter's ready," she said. "We'll send it first thing tomorrow, and if he tries to pull anything else, we'll escalate." "Perfect," I replied, a small smile creeping onto my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. Richard had thought he could steamroll me, but he was about to learn that I wasn't going down so easily. The next morning, Laura and I finalised the cease and desist letter and sent it to Richard. The language was clear and firm. Any further attempts to claim ownership of the cabin or involve the buyer would result in legal action. I couldn't help but imagine his reaction when he received it, probably a mix of anger and disbelief. For years, he had gotten away with manipulating and intimidating people into submission, but this time he was up against a wall he couldn't charm his way through. Later that day, the real estate agent emailed me the documentation she had promised. Seeing Richard's signature on the fraudulent sale agreement made my stomach churn, but it also strengthened my resolve. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had bulldozed right through it. That evening, I received a call from Detective Miller, a local officer Laura had contacted to help with the case. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone professional, "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can move forward with a formal investigation, if you wish." "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "I want to pursue this." Detective Miller continued, "We'll start by contacting the buyer and explaining the situation. If Richard continues to interfere, we will escalate this to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation." "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Please let me know if you need anything else from me." As I hung up, I felt a wave of relief mixed with anticipation. Things were finally moving, and there was no turning back now. The next day, Richard called. His voice was filled with anger, but underneath it there was a hint of desperation. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Catherine?" he demanded. "You're ruining everything." "No, Richard," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself." "You've always been so ungrateful," he sneered. "I stepped in when your mum couldn't handle things, and this is how you repay me?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "You didn't step in, Richard, you took over. You manipulated, lied, and used people to get what you wanted. And now you're paying the price." He started to argue, but I cut him off. "This conversation is over. If you have anything else to say, take it up with my lawyer." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. Richard's days of pushing me around were over. I was finally in control. 2 days later, Detective Miller called with an update. "Miss Daniels, we've spoken with the buyer and they've agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are willing to cooperate with the investigation." Relief flooded through me. "That's great news. Does this mean the sale is officially voided?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The cabin remains under your and Miss Langley's ownership. However, we'll need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Do you wish to press charges?" I hesitated for just a moment. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want him held accountable." "Understood," Detective Miller said. "We'll proceed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation." After the call, I let out a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm return. The cabin was safe and Richard's plans were falling apart. Later that afternoon, I called Laura to share the news. "The sale is officially void," I told her. "The buyer is backing out and the cabin is ours again." "That's a huge win," Laura exclaimed, her excitement clear. "But what about Richard?" "The police are moving forward with their investigation," I explained. "He's not getting away with this." "Good," she said firmly. "It's about time someone stood up to him." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. For years, I had let Richard get away with so much. His manipulations, his sense of entitlement, his utter disregard for boundaries. But this time, I fought back, and it felt like a turning point, not just for this situation, but for how I would approach everything in my life from now on. That evening, I went to the cabin for the first time since I returned home. Stepping inside, I was hit with an overwhelming wave of emotion. The familiar scent of the wood panels, the creak of the floorboards. It all reminded me of why this place meant so much. I sat by the fireplace, letting the peace of the mountains wash over me. Based on the evidence we've gathered, the case against him is strong, Detective Miller had said earlier. Hearing those words brought a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and even a touch of sadness. "Thank you for everything," I had said sincerely to the detective. "You handled this with a lot of strength." "It's not easy standing up to family," he had replied, "but you did the right thing." After the call, I sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. Richard had been a constant force in my life, bringing chaos and conflict, trying to keep the peace, especially with him. But this time, I'd stood my ground. It felt like a turning point, not just for my relationship with Richard, but for how I saw myself. "You know," Laura said, interrupting my thoughts, "this cabin has always been more than just a property. It's a symbol of everything we've built, everything we've worked for. Don't ever let anyone take that from you again." Her words hit home. The cabin wasn't just a house in the mountains, it was a reflection of everything I had fought for. Richard's greed had tried to take it from me, but now it had become my refuge again. Each creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the trees outside reminded me of what I had worked to protect. After the charges were filed, I didn't hear much from Richard. My mum called once, her voice hesitant. "You know how he gets, Catherine," she said, her usual defense of him ringing hollow this time. "I do," I replied evenly, "and that's why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For the first time, there was no attempt to guilt me, no desperate plea to convince me otherwise. "So what's next for you, Kathy?" she asked. "You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Richard. What's your next big move?" I thought for a moment, the answer coming to me with surprising clarity. "I'm going to keep doing what I love," I said. "Volunteering, traveling, living my life on my terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I live." She smiled, raising her glass to that. As the days passed, I reflected more on everything I'd learned from this experience. In the cool, pine-scented air of the cabin, for the first time in years, I felt truly at home. Not just in the cabin, but in my own life.